betrayed and dumped by her husband. 55-year-old woman won the lottery. When he came crawling back, her response left everyone stunned. Margaret Thornton stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying her lipstick. At 55, she still turned heads with her elegant figure and warm, inviting smile. Her chestnut hair, now streaked with subtle hints of gray, was styled in a classic bob that framed her face perfectly. As she put the finishing touches on her makeup, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement in her stomach. Tonight was her 30th wedding anniversary, and her husband, Robert, promised her a special surprise. 3 decades of marriage had seen its ups and downs. Margaret felt blessed. She and Robert had built a comfortable life together in their suburban home, raised 2 wonderful children who were now off building lives of their own, and had managed to keep the spark of romance alive through it all. Or so she thought. Margaret glanced at the clock, 7:15 p.m. Robert should have been home an hour ago. She tried his cell phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. A niggling worry began to creep into her mind. She pushed it aside. Robert was probably just stuck in traffic or caught up with a last-minute work emergency. He wouldn't forget their anniversary. As the hours ticked by, Margaret's worry turned to fear, then to anger. By midnight, she was sitting alone at the dining room table, the candles burned down to stubs, meticulously prepared dinner cold and untouched. She had called the hospitals, the police, even Robert's colleagues. No one had seen him. It was nearly 2 a.m. when she heard the key in the lock. Margaret rushed to the door, relief and anger warring within her. The sight that greeted her stopped her cold. Robert stumbled in, his silver hair disheveled, his shirt half unbuttoned. The smell of alcohol and cheap perfume clung to him like a cloud. But it was the lipstick on his collar, a garish shade of red that Margaret would never wear, truly broke her heart. "Where have you been?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, choked with emotion. Robert looked up, his blue eyes bloodshot and unfocused. For a moment, he seemed confused, as if he couldn't quite place where he was or who he was talking to. Then his face crumpled. "Maggie," he slurred, using the nickname she once loved but now felt like a knife to her heart. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what, Robert? For forgetting our anniversary? For coming home drunk? Or for—" She couldn't bring herself to say the words, to give voice to the betrayal she could see written all over him. Robert stumbled forward, reaching for her, but Margaret stepped back. "Please, Maggie, let me explain. It's not what you think." But it was exactly what she thought. Over the next painful hour, the truth came spilling out of Robert like poison from a wound. There was another woman, Jennifer, his young secretary. It had been going on for months. He had lost track of the days, forgotten their anniversary in the haze of his affair. Margaret listened in stunned silence, each word another blow to the life she thought she had. 30 years of marriage, of trust, of love, all of it crumbling before her eyes. "I want a divorce," Robert said finally, his voice oddly clear despite his inebriated state. "Jennifer's pregnant. We're going to start a new life together." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Margaret gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, her knuckles turning white with the effort. "Pregnant?" she repeated, the word tasting like ashes in her mouth. "You're leaving me for a woman young enough to be our daughter, and she's pregnant?" Robert had the grace to look ashamed, but it did little to soothe the inferno of pain and betrayal raging in Margaret's heart. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I never meant for this to happen. But I can't deny my feelings. Jennifer, she makes me feel young again, alive. And I make you feel old and dead, is that it?" Margaret's voice was razor sharp, cutting through Robert's excuses. 30 years, Robert. 30 years of my life I gave you, and this is how you repay me?" The argument that followed was brutal, years of unspoken resentments and hidden hurts bubbling to the surface. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Margaret's world had been shattered beyond recognition. Robert packed a bag and left, promising to be in touch about the divorce proceeding. As the door closed behind him, Margaret sank to the floor, her body racked with sobs. How had it come to this? How had she not seen the signs? In the days that followed, Margaret moved through her life like a ghost. She called her children, Michael and Sarah, to break the news. Their shock and anger on her behalf was both a comfort and a fresh source of pain. She watched as words spread through their social circle, saw the pitying looks and heard the whispered gossip. The beautiful home she had made with Robert now felt like a mausoleum, every corner haunted by memories of a life that no longer existed. The photos on the walls, the shared mementos accumulated over 3 decades, all of it seemed to mock her. Reminders of a happiness that had been built on a foundation of lies. As the weeks passed and the divorce proceedings began, Margaret found herself facing a future she had never imagined. At 55, she was starting over, alone. The life she had built, the identity she had carved out for herself as Robert Thornton's wife, was gone. In its place was a vast unknown, terrifying in its emptiness. But as Margaret stood in front of the mirror one morning, staring at the stranger she saw reflected there, she felt something stir within her. Beneath the pain and the betrayal, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a spark of something else. Something that felt a lot like determination. She might be down, Margaret realized, but she wasn't out. Not by a long shot. Robert had betrayed her, had tossed aside 30 years of marriage for a younger model. But Margaret was not going to let that be the end of her story. As she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, Margaret made a silent vow to herself. This was not the end. It was a new beginning. And somehow, someway, she was going to find a way to rise from the ashes of her broken marriage and build a new life for herself. Little did Margaret know that fate had a surprising twist in store for her. One that would not only change her life, but would give her the opportunity for the sweetest revenge she could ever imagine. The months following Robert's betrayal were the darkest of Margaret's life. The divorce proceedings dragged on, each meeting with lawyers a fresh reminder of her shattered world. Robert, it seemed, was determined to leave her with as little as possible, fighting tooth and nail over every asset they had accumulated together. Margaret found herself struggling not just emotionally, but financially as well. She had been a homemaker for most of their marriage, supporting Robert's career and raising their children. Now, at 55, she faced the daunting prospect of re-entering the workforce with outdated skills and a resume gap spanning decades. Her first job interview was a disaster. Dressed in a suit that suddenly felt outdated and ill-fitting, Margaret sat across from a hiring manager young enough to be her daughter. Pitying looks and gentle rejections became a painful routine. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton," they would say, "but we're looking for someone with more recent experience." As the divorce neared its final stages, Margaret was forced to face a harsh reality. The beautiful home she had lovingly tended for years was to be sold. The proceeds split between her and Robert. Her lawyer advised her to start looking for an apartment she could afford, on the meager alimony Robert had grudgingly agreed to pay. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that Margaret found herself standing in front of a small, dingy apartment in a part of town she had never imagined living in. A real estate agent, kind-faced woman named Clara, tried to put a positive spin on things. "It's cozy," Clara said, gesturing to the cramped living room with its worn carpet and faded wallpaper. "And the location is quite convenient." Margaret nodded numbly, trying to imagine her antique furniture and cherished mementos crammed into this tiny space. This was what her life had come to. From a sprawling suburban home to a one-bedroom apartment with a view of a brick wall. That night, alone in the echoing emptiness of her soon-to-be former home, Margaret hit rock bottom. Curled up on the couch, half-empty bottle of wine on the coffee table in front of her, she allowed herself to wallow in self-pity. Where had she gone wrong? How had she failed so spectacularly at the one thing she had devoted her life to? Her marriage? As she reached for the wine bottle, her hand knocked against something. It was a framed photo, one of the few she hadn't packed away yet. In it, a much younger Margaret smiled at the camera, her arms around Michael and Sarah, and just children. The sight of her younger self, so full of life and hope, stirred something in Margaret's. "Enough," he whispered to the empty room. "Enough feeling sorry for yourself, Margaret Thornton." With shaky legs, she stood and made her way to the bathroom. The woman who stared back at her from the mirror was a stranger, eyes puffy from crying, hair unkempt, defeat written in every line of her face. Behind the pain, Margaret saw a glimmer of the strong, capable woman she used to be. The woman she could be again. That night marked a turning point for Margaret. She might have lost her marriage, her home, and her comfortable life, but she hadn't lost herself. Not yet, and she wasn't about to. The next morning, Margaret embarked on what she called her redemption project. She dug out her old laptop and began researching job training programs. She discovered that the local community college offered courses in office administration and bookkeeping, skills that were always in demand. It wasn't easy. Sitting in classrooms surrounded by students half her age, struggling with technology that seemed to have advanced light years since she last worked, Margaret often felt overwhelmed. But she persevered, studying late into the night, determined to prove to herself and to Robert she was far from finished. Gradually, Margaret began to rediscover parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She joined a support group for divorced women, finding solace and strength in their shared experiences. On a whim, she signed up for a pottery class, rekindling a passion for art she had abandoned in her youth. Her children, Michael and Sarah, watched their mother's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. They had been furious with their father, barely speaking to him since the divorce began. Seeing their mother fight to rebuild her life inspired them to be there for her in ways they hadn't before. "Mom," Sarah said one evening during one of her regular visits, "I'm so proud of you. You're amazing, you know that?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's words. "I'm just trying to survive, sweetheart." Sarah shook her head, taking her mother's hand. "No, Mom, you're doing more than surviving. You're thriving. Dad's the one who's losing out, not you." As the months passed, Margaret's hard work began to pay off. She completed her courses with top marks, earning glowing recommendations from her instructors. With her updated skills and newfound confidence, she landed a job as an administrative assistant at a local nonprofit organization. The pay wasn't much, certainly nothing compared to the lifestyle she had enjoyed as Robert's wife. But it was a start, and more importantly, it was hers. Every paycheck, modest as it was, felt like a victory. Moving day came, and Margaret found herself looking at her new apartment with fresh eyes. It was small, yes, but it was clean and bright, and it was hers. With Sarah and Michael's help, she turned the tiny space into a cozy haven, filling it with the warmth and love that had always been her trademark. On her first night in her new home, Margaret sat on her small balcony, sipping a cup of tea and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For the first time in over a year, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had survived the worst year of her life. She had faced her fears, confronted her insecurities, and come out stronger on the other side. As she gazed at the stars peeking through the city's glow, Margaret allowed herself to dream of the future. She was only 56. There was still so much life to be lived, so many experiences to be had. Who knew what opportunities tomorrow might bring? Little did Margaret know that fate was about to deal her a hand beyond her wildest dreams. Twist of fortune that would not only change her life forever, but would give her the chance to show Robert and the world just what Margaret Thornton was truly made of. Margaret settled into her new life with a determination that surprised even herself. Her job at the nonprofit, while not glamorous, gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She threw herself into the work, quickly becoming an indispensable part of the team. Her warmth and efficiency endeared her to her colleagues, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly valued for who she was, not just as someone's wife. It was a Friday evening, nearly 18 months after the fateful night Robert had confessed his affair, when Margaret's life took another, unexpected turn. She was tidying up her small kitchen, the radio playing softly in the background, when a knock at the door interrupted her routine. "Dara," Margaret exclaimed, surprised to see her daughter standing in the hallway, a mischievous grin on her face. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. Is everything okay?" Sarah's grin widened as she held up a bottle of champagne. "Everything's great, Mom. In fact, it's time to celebrate." Puzzled but intrigued, Margaret ushered her daughter inside. Sarah bustled about, grabbing glasses and popping the cork with a flourish that made Margaret laugh. "Okay, spill it," Margaret said, accepting a glass of bubbly. "What are we celebrating?" Sarah's eyes twinkled. "We, dear mother, are celebrating your birthday." Margaret blinked in surprise. With everything that had happened, she had completely forgotten that tomorrow was her 57th birthday. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't have to." "Ah," Sarah interrupted, wagging a finger. "No protest. You deserve to be celebrated, Mom, and I have just the thing to kick off your birthday weekend." With a dramatic flourish, Sarah produced an envelope from her purse and handed it to Margaret. Inside was a single lottery ticket. "I know it's silly," Sarah said, a hint of sheepishness creeping into her voice. "But I had a good feeling about this one. Who knows? Maybe it's your turn for some good luck." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. The gesture, small as it was, touched her deeply. "Thank you, darling." "Perfect." They spent the evening chatting and laughing, the champagne loosening their tongues and brightening their spirit. It was late when Sarah finally left, leaving Margaret with a warm glow that had nothing to do with the alcohol. The next morning, Margaret awoke to a flurry of birthday wishes from friends and family. Michael called from across the country, promising to visit soon. Even her ex-sister-in-law, Janet, reached out with a kind message, their friendship having survived the divorce. It was mid-afternoon when Margaret remembered the lottery ticket. She was about to toss it in her purse to check later when a nagging feeling made her pause. On a whim, she decided to check the numbers online. What happened next would be forever etched in Margaret's memory. As she input the numbers, her hands began to shake. She blinked, sure she must be seeing things wrong. But no, there it was. Every number a perfect match. Margaret sat heavily on her couch, her mind reeling. She checked, double-checked, triple-checked. There was no mistake. She, Margaret Thornton, was now the winner of a $137 million lottery jackpot. The next few hours passed in a blur. Calls to the lottery commission, to a lawyer, to financial advisors. Sarah arrived, alerted by a cryptic text from her mother, promptly burst into tears of joy when Margaret shared the news. "Can't believe it," Sarah kept saying, hugging her mother tightly. "Mom, do you realize what this means? You're set for life." As the reality of her win began to sink in, Margaret felt a whirlwind of emotions. Joy, disbelief, excitement, and underneath it all, a quiet sense of vindication. After everything she had been through, after all the struggles and heartaches, fortune had finally smiled upon her. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret, wisely choosing to remain anonymous to the public, assembled a team of financial experts to help her manage her newfound wealth. She was determined not to be one of those lottery winners who squandered their fortune. With her team's guidance, Margaret made her first major decision. She bought a beautiful townhouse in a prestigious neighborhood. As she stood in the spacious living room, bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows, Margaret felt a sense of coming home. This was a fresh start, a new chapter in her life. But even as she reveled in her good fortune, Margaret never forgot the struggle that had brought her to this point. She thought of her colleagues at the nonprofit, of the causes they fought for every day. And so, in a move that would make headlines, though her identity remained protected, Margaret donated a substantial sum to the organization, ensuring their good work could continue for years to come. As news of her generosity spread, Margaret began to receive letters from people all over the country, stories of hardship, dreams deferred, hope in the face of adversity. Each one touched her deeply, reminding her of her own journey. It was these letters that sparked an idea in Margaret's mind. She had been given a second chance at life, an opportunity to rewrite her story. But what about all those other people out there, struggling as she had struggled? What if she could help give them a second chance too? With growing excitement, Margaret began to formulate a plan. Foundation, she decided. A way to use her wealth to make a real difference in people's lives. She would focus on helping women like herself, those who found themselves starting over later in life, whether due to divorce, widowhood, or other circumstances. As Margaret threw herself into this new project, she felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she had experienced before. This was more than revenge against Robert, more than proving her own worth. This was about creating a legacy, about turning her pain into something positive that could help others. But even as Margaret embraced her new role as a philanthropist, a small part of her couldn't help but think of Robert. He had discarded her. deemed her worthless. Now, she was in a position to show him, and the world, just how wrong he had been. The stage was set for Margaret's sweet revenge. But as she was about to discover, revenge can be a double-edged sword, and the path to true happiness might lead her in unexpected direction. As the months rolled by, Margaret threw herself into her new role with gusto. The Margaret Thornton Second Chances Foundation quickly gained recognition for its innovative approach to helping women rebuild their lives. From job training programs to small business grants, Margaret's foundation became a beacon of hope, countless women facing challenges similar to those she had overcome. One crisp autumn morning, Margaret found herself standing before a packed auditorium, preparing to give a speech at a women's empowerment conference. As she looked out at the sea of faces, women of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life, she felt a surge of pride and purpose. "Ladies," Margaret began, her voice strong and clear, "each of us has a story of trials and triumphs, of setbacks and comeback. My story began with betrayal and loss, but it didn't end there. Neither will yours." As Margaret shared her journey, from the depths of despair to the heights of success, she saw heads nodding, tears being wiped away, and hope kindling in eyes that had perhaps been dark for too long. It was in moments like these that Margaret felt truly alive, truly fulfilled. After the speech, as Margaret mingled with attendees, a familiar face caught her eye. It was Clara, the real estate agent who had shown her that dingy apartment what felt like a lifetime ago. "Mrs. Thornton," Clara exclaimed, her eyes wide with recognition. "I can hardly believe it's you. You look amazing." Margaret smiled warmly, genuinely pleased to see the kind-faced woman. "Clara, what a lovely surprise. And please, call me Margaret." As they chatted, Clara's expression grew serious. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, Margaret, but I'm so glad to see you thriving. I remember how broken you looked that day, and I've often wondered what became of you. To see you now, like this, it's truly inspiring." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat at Clara's words. "Thank you, Clara. It's been quite a journey." As if on cue, Margaret's assistant, a bright young woman named Zoe, approached with a tablet in hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Miss Thornton, but you have that meeting with the board in 20 minutes. Margaret nodded, turning back to Clara with an apologetic smile. "Duty calls, I'm afraid. It was wonderful to see you, Clara." As Margaret walked away, she overheard Clara whisper to someone nearby, "Can you believe that's the same woman? Talk about a glow-up." The comment, though not meant for her ears, brought a smile to Margaret's face. She had come a long way indeed. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret's foundation launched a new initiative focused on providing affordable housing for single mothers, a project that was particularly close to her heart. She threw herself into the work, overseeing every detail with a passionate intensity that inspired her entire team. It was during this busy period that Margaret received an unexpected invitation. Her alma mater, a prestigious university she had attended briefly before marrying Robert, was holding a gala to honor distinguished alumni. To her surprise, Margaret found herself on the list of honorees, recognized for her philanthropic work. As Margaret stood in front of her full-length mirror on the night of the gala, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the dowdy, defeated housewife she had been just 2 years ago. In her place stood a confident, elegant woman in a stunning designer gown, silver-streaked hair, styled in a chic updo. The gala was a glittering affair, the ballroom filled with the cream of society. As Margaret made her rounds, graciously accepting congratulations and engaging in small talk, she couldn't help but feel a sense of sweet satisfaction. This was her world now, a world she had built for herself. It was halfway through the evening when she saw him. Robert, looking older and somewhat deflated in a tuxedo that seemed a bit too tight, stood near the bar. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Robert's face went through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally a grudging admiration. Margaret felt her heart race, old wounds threatening to reopen. But then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and did something that surprised even herself. She walked directly towards him. "Hello, Robert," Margaret said, her voice steady and confident. Robert seemed to struggle for words. "Margaret, you look "Thank you," Margaret said simply, not needing or wanting his compliments. "I hope you're well." Robert nodded, still seeming off balance. "I'm managing, and you? I've heard a lot about what you've been up to. It's impressive, Maggie, truly." The use of her old nickname no longer had the power to hurt her. Margaret simply smiled. "Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it?" She paused, then added, "How's Jennifer?" Robert's face fell slightly. It's complicated." Margaret felt a twinge of something. Not quite pity, but perhaps understanding. "Isn't it always?" she said softly. Before Robert could respond, Margaret's name was called from the stage. It was time for her to receive her award. "If you'll excuse me," Margaret said, turning to go. But then she paused, looking back at Robert. "You know, I spent a long time being angry with you, Robert. But now I think I should thank you." Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" Margaret's smile was genuine this time. "For setting me free. Goodbye, Robert." As Margaret walked away, head held high, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The encounter she had dreaded for so long was over, and she had emerged stronger than ever. Standing on the stage, accepting her award to thunderous applause, Margaret felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. This was more than revenge, this was redemption. This was Margaret Thornton, coming into her own at last. But as Margaret was about to discover, life still had a few surprises in store for her. Greatest challenge and the greatest reward. Her journey was yet to come. As Margaret stepped off the stage, award in hand, she was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. The buzz of excitement in the room was palpable, and Margaret found herself at the center of it all. It was a heady feeling, so different from the invisibility she had often felt as Robert's wife. Among the crowd, Margaret spotted a familiar face. Janet, her former sister-in-law. Unlike Robert, Janet had remained a steadfast friend throughout the divorce and beyond. The two women embraced warmly. "You were magnificent up there, Marge," Janet said, her eyes shining with pride. "I always knew you had it in you." Margaret squeezed Janet's hand gratefully. "Thank you for always believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." As they chatted, catching up on each other's lives, Janet's expression turned serious. "I hate to bring this up on your big night, but have you heard about Robert?" Margaret felt a flicker of concern. Despite everything, a part of her would always care about the man she had spent 3 decades with. "What about him? Is he all right?" Janet sighed. "Well, that depends on your definition of all right. The affair with Jennifer, it didn't last. She left him about 6 months ago, took half of everything in the divorce. And now..." "Now what?" Margaret prompted, a mix of emotions swirling within her. "He's been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's," Janet said softly. "Progressing faster than the doctors expected. He's not doing well, Marge." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. For a moment, she struggled to breathe, the glittering ballroom fading away as memories of her life with Robert flashed through her mind. Despite the pain he had caused her, despite the betrayal, the thought of Robert facing this cruel disease alone broke her heart. As the gala wound down, Margaret found herself unable to shake thoughts of Robert from her mind. The sweet taste of success she had been savoring all evening now felt bitter in her mouth. Was this truly the revenge she had wanted? The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would once again change the course of her life. She reached out to Robert's doctor, using her connections to ensure he received the best possible care. Then, steeling herself, she paid a visit to the assisted living facility where Robert now resided. The man who greeted her was a shadow of the Robert she had known. Thin and frail, with a bewildered look in his once sharp blue eyes, he barely seemed to recognize her at first. "Maggie?" he said hesitantly, his voice quavering. "Is it really you?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, Robert, it's me." What followed was a conversation that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. In his more lucid moments, Robert expressed deep remorse for his actions, for the pain he had caused her. In his confused states, he sometimes thought they were still married, speaking of future plans with a childlike enthusiasm that broke Margaret's heart. As she prepared to leave, Robert grasped her hand. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he said, his eyes suddenly clear and filled with regret. "I was a fool. You were always the best thing in my life, and I threw it away." Margaret felt a lifetime of hurt, anger, and resentment drain away, replaced by a profound sense of peace. "Forgive you, Robert," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. In the weeks and months that followed, Margaret found herself embarking on a new chapter of her life, one she never could have anticipated. She took an active role in Robert's care, ensuring he had the best possible quality of life as his condition progressed. This act of compassion did not go unnoticed. Margaret's foundation expanded its focus to include support for families dealing with Alzheimer's and other degenerative diseases. Her personal story of forgiveness and grace in the face of adversity inspired countless others to find healing in their own lives. As Margaret approached her 60th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past few years. From betrayed wife to self-made millionaire, from seeking revenge to finding forgiveness, each step had shaped her into the woman she now was. On a warm summer evening, Margaret stood on the balcony of her penthouse, overlooking the city she now called home. Sarah and Michael were inside, along with their spouses and children, preparing for a family dinner. The sound of laughter drifted out to her, warming her heart. As she gazed at the sunset painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Life had not turned out the way she had planned, but perhaps it had turned out exactly as it was meant to. The revenge she had once craved now seemed hollow in comparison to the rich, fulfilling life she had built. She had found success not in making Robert suffer, but in rising above the pain he had caused her. In choosing forgiveness over bitterness, in using her fortune to help others rather than simply indulge herself, Margaret had found a happiness and purpose she never could have imagined. A soft breeze caressed her face, and Margaret closed her eyes, savoring the moment. She thought of the frightened, heartbroken woman she had been just a few short years ago, and wished she could reach back through time to offer words of comfort and hope. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered to her past self, "and the best is yet to come." "Lan?" Sarah's voice called from inside. "Dinner's ready." Margaret turned, a smile spreading across her face. "Coming, sweetheart," she called back. As she walked back into the warm embrace of her family, Margaret knew that this love, this purpose, this peace was the sweetest revenge of all. She had not just survived, she had thrived. And in doing so, she had written a new story for herself, one of resilience, compassion, and unwavering hope. The Margaret Thornton who entered that dining room was not defined by her past hurts or her bank account. She was defined by the lives she had touched, the difference she had made in the world, and the love she both gave and received freely. And as she looked around at the faces of her loved ones, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't have it any other way.